Amalekites...
Well, let's not talk about the Amalekites, in part because here's the problem. For most Christians, the Old Testament is different than the New and is seen through the light of the New. So
but
I'm
God,
not.
the God
if
is
you
the
want
same.
to, if you want to go to, Dennis Prager, who has written about this from a Jewish perspective, has written about the Deuteronomy, the Book of Kings, the Amalekites.
Sure, we can bring him out
what he
later,
considers to be the justifiable massacre of the Canaanites. I don't really want to go there because.
Well, I know why you don't want to go there.
Well, the reason I don't want to go there, the Old Testament is full of horrific massacres.
Yes, and
that is. Hold on.
Massacres which are ordained.
Massacres which appear to be ordained by Yahweh directly. Sure. Agreed. And
why are you saying Yahweh instead of God? Why are you trying to distance yourself from the God of the Old Testament?
Well, I'm not trying to distance myself. I'm simply trying to say that any reader...
So why is that the first time you've used the word Yahweh in this conversation?
I'll tell you why. Because there is a movement within the Bible itself that you are completely missing.
What you're listening to is a debate between Alex O'Connor and Dinesh D'Souza. Alex is a YouTuber, podcaster, and one of the internet's brightest young skeptics. He's become famous for his conversations with figures like Richard Dawkins, Jordan Peterson, and William Lane Craig. Dinesh is a right-wing political commentator, conspiracy theorist, author, filmmaker, and also a convicted felon who received a presidential pardon by Donald Trump for his crimes. And in case you think I'm biased against Dinesh, I'm not. That's just what his Wikipedia says. Clearly, whoever wrote that portion of his Wikipedia article doesn't like him all that much. But what you just heard right now is a portion from a now notorious debate between Alex and Dinesh. Alex takes the side of the skeptic, of course, and Dinesh takes the side of the Christian apologist. I say notorious because in the section we're about to listen to, Dinesh tries to defend the trajectory of the Bible in a way that is not satisfying to Alex. And in fact, many have commented online about how Dinesh fails to adequately defend the points that he's trying to raise. Now, I don't want to bias you one way or the other, so let's just listen to what Dinesh and Alex have to say.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount, referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and law.
Referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Old Testament law. And what I'm referring to here is an Old Testament law, which you're now trying to distance yourself from and say that it's sort of different to the New Testament.
I'm saying that
that's not what Jesus thought.
I'm saying you're missing the developmental track of the Bible that is obvious to any intelligent reader. Let me give you one example of what I'm talking about.
Tell me about the Amalekites. Tell me what the developmental
It's not about the Amalekites. It's about the way that the whole story of the Bible changes in tone and mood and message. For example,
help me out here. Just tell me where, any way you like. Tell me where this fits into that trajectory.
Okay, I'll tell you where. The underlying message of the Old Testament is an eye for an eye. The Amalekites are the enemies of the Israelites. The Israelites will crush them with the same venom that the Amalekites would have crushed the Israelites. That's called an eye for an eye.
Including
now,
the children,
hold on.
The children, the infants,
the cattle,
infants, the sheep, the camels, the donkeys.
Yeah, that Dennis Prager says yes, but my point is different. You will not find that spirit at all in the New Testament. In fact, in the New Testament, you've got a spirit of forgiveness. So what I'm getting at is to pretend like you don't have this. Christianity is named after Christ. It's based on Christ as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. But what does fulfillment mean? It actually means transcendence. In Abraham's time, blood sacrifices are normal. When Christ comes as a sacrifice, Christ is the lamb. The point is, those blood sacrifices aren't necessary anymore. Listen, That's the Christian reading. And you keep filibustering me because you know that the Bible is showing a movement in a direction, and to miss the movement is to miss the Bible. Let's look at God in the Bible.
Hold on.
Let me make one quick point about God in the Bible.
There's nothing quick about what you're doing, Dinesh. There's nothing quick about what you're doing. I need to be allowed to respond to what you're saying. I am getting sick whenever I have these conversations.
You're cross-examining me on the justice of smiting the Amalekites. Honestly, I don't see any justice in it, but I do agree that was the eye for an eye ethic of the Old Testament that is repudiated and transformed and transfigured in the New.
I've had this conversation so many times, most recently with William Lane Craig. At least he had the gall to just tell me that yes, that was a moral thing for God to do. I get sick to death of people hand-waving away this genocide by some vague reference to the fact that Jesus came along to do something which somehow kind of undoes the immorality of it. Like, this is not an eye for an eye. This is a genocide of combatant men, innocent women, and children, and animals. Saul is punished by God for not killing all of the animals. Like
that is actually a ludicrous misreading of what's happening with Saul and David.
Let me just make a quick point. Let me just make a quick point. I have to make this point.
Okay.
I've got to read the text from Joshua as well. I think it's important. Like, read these texts for yourself. There is no way that I'm misreading this text. We know that this is what's happening in the slaughter of Ai. That's a type of Canaanite. In Joshua, we're told that when Israel had finished killing all of the men in Ai, in the fields and in the wilderness, where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. That is to say, that we're told that this is just because the promised land was inhabited, and God's God, he's allowed to do this. So because the Israelites want that land, they have to go and chase out the Ai. So they chase them into the wilderness. They chase after them. They slaughter them in the wilderness. They then turn around, come back into the city, and kill who's left. Who's left if the combatants have run away? The women and the children. This is intolerable, and I cannot have it simply waved away.
All right, hang on.
Jesus.
Let me just for a second.
It can't happen. It can't keep happening.
You're completely blind to the irony of what you're saying.
Dinesh, can we pause for just a second?
Yeah.
Now, if you've just listened to that as a Christian, then that's got to be a pretty bitter pill to swallow. In fact, if you've listened to the entire debate, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes, it's hard to see how Dinesh gets any wins, and by extension, the Bible. Alex is a formidable debater. I'm not sharing this portion of the debate to bias you against the Bible. I'm a Bible-believing pastor. In fact, my entire career working with Signs of the Times magazine is focused on helping skeptics to not only understand the Bible, but to see how it could fit into their everyday life. And ultimately, to see how the Bible is moving people toward faith, hope, and love in the person of Jesus. But Dinesh fails to do what so many of us fail to do, and that's to understand and communicate the complexity of the Bible, especially the parts of it that are not palatable to our 21st century sensibilities. In this episode, we're talking to Daniel Christie. Daniel didn't have a church background. He grew up in rural Australia in an environment where the Bible was the last thing anybody ever thought of. And yet his entire life he has been a skeptic. But interestingly, Daniel's skepticism didn't lead him away from the Bible. It actually led him to it. As a result, Daniel became a Christian and then decided to dedicate his life to helping people understand the Bible better and live in Christian community. Daniel is a kindred spirit of mine because, like me, he hasn't got a doctorate. He's more of an armchair scholar. That doesn't mean he doesn't know his stuff, though. Part of me wonders what would have happened if Daniel debated Alex O'Connor instead of Dinesh. But that's purely the realm of speculation. So let's go now to our interview with Daniel Christie. This is Science Radio, episode 210. The Bible is for Skeptics Too.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. We have none other with us than Dan Christie. Dan is the man who has answered many of my questions over the years about the Bible, God, just life in general. He's full of wisdom. He's a history buff, which always makes for interesting conversation. So, Dan, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're tackling a huge topic. We are looking at some common questions that people ask about the Bible. We could easily do an entire podcast on each question we're about to ask. But so we're just going to be scraping the surface here, but we're going to attempt some of the questions around what is the Bible, where did it come from, and why on earth would we view it as the source of authority and guidance in our lives. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear just a bit more from you, Dan. You're a pastor, so your life obviously revolves around the Bible. But can you tell us a little bit about your life leading into that? Like, why does the Bible mean so much to you? And just tell us a bit about your story.
My background didn't grow up religious at all. There was some blessing to that. I was pretty neutral. I grew up in mining towns throughout Australia, Western Australia, Central Queensland. So I was a miner's son. Grew up drinking, playing footy, doing all the usual things. It was about 15 years old, first encountered religion, went to a church, encountered the gospel, gave my life to God, and that began really a journey, which was a good journey. I'm naturally skeptical. So what was good about that was, even though I came into a church, I thought, wait a minute, I've accepted this gospel, but how do I know which denomination is right? How do I know which faith is right? So I spent the next 4 years, started when I was 15, going to every church I could, asking questions and realizing that there was beautiful people everywhere. And there was bad people everywhere as well. But it was very good because it gave me a good wide perspective of it that eventually led for me to go into what we would call evangelism around 2006. I went into evangelism for probably 3, 4, 5 years. I was doing that on and off, where I would go out into communities throughout Australia, just sharing the Bible with people. That was good because I got to sit with many different faiths and backgrounds and really listen, but also being challenged in a good way on what I believe. It's really a journey as to why the Bible means so much to me. I think, like a lot of people, it's the simple things in the beginning, but as you go further, you get into the more complex things and in the vastness of Scripture. And one of the things I'm glad God gave me was a critical brain to always ask why. And even now, we just continue to pursue truth, continue to challenge things. And that always leads, I find, to a more solid faith for me in the Bible.
If you're someone who has grown up with the Bible, you might relate to this. If you're someone who has grown up with the Bible, it doesn't seem that strange to believe it and to follow it. But if you haven't, it's crazy to take this ancient book and base your life on it. That's obviously why people are like, what? You follow the Bible? And I guess the idea that most people have is that the Bible was written thousands of years ago by a whole bunch of random kind of messed up people. So like, why would we follow that? How is that reliable?
This is a good question to begin with. I would say that even if you are growing up as a religious person, you should ask this question. That the Bible, or as we see it today, how can I trust it? Is it valid? Is it authoritative? Very good question. Yeah, we'll break it down. We'll look into that in different sections. Probably when you look at this, probably to start with, as a lot of people would say to me, it certainly has some good moral teachings in it, 10 Commandments and these sorts of things, but I'm not so sure if I really claim it as a divine book or claim it as a religious source, that this is God's word speaking to me. It's got some nice stories in it. Surely we should follow those. There's no raising of the dead and this sort of thing. So people often like to split that. The problem with that premise is you are claiming the Bible to be something that it never claimed to be. To give you a couple of examples, if I came to you and I told you that I was the greatest golfer in the world, that's a big claim. You're going to want to see some evidence, right? You're going to take me on the golf course and say, let's see what you got, right? The Bible itself claims to be inspired. There are multiple verses, 2 Timothy 3:15 and 16, 2 Peter 1:21. There's many verses in the Bible where the authors would say that they were inspired by God, or men were moved by the Holy Spirit, or God spoke to them directly. These are big claims. And so you really can't approach the Bible and say, I'm going to ignore that and just say it's a really nice book. Well, it doesn't really leave that for you to do it. It is either what it says to be or it's not. So I would just challenge people on that position. That goes not only for the Bible, but for really any of the claims. Jesus himself claiming to be God. He's either crazy, as C.S. Lewis says, he's either crazy, he's a liar, or he's the Lord. Yeah, so essentially that's what we have to do, is we have to analyze it that way.
So you mentioned inspiration, and I know that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people outside and inside the Christian faith. So when you say that the Bible is inspired, what do you mean? Do you mean that it was literally dictated from God himself? What do you mean when you say inspired?
Yeah, so it's a sort of general term, but yeah, basically there are different degrees or variations of inspiration. You'll even often hear the term revelation. I guess I'll define the word revelation quickly. Revelation is something that is revealed to you that you wouldn't have otherwise known unless God revealed it to you, so to speak. Jesus, for example, said to Peter, after asking, who do people say that I am? He says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, flesh has not revealed this to you, but my Father. So this is the concept of revelation. So when we get to inspiration, like it's quoted in 2 Timothy 3:16, that all scripture is inspired by God, this comes in various forms. One of those forms, of course, is God speaking directly to human beings. In the case of Moses, this is why Moses is held in very high regard. He's only one step really from God. That's a very privileged position. There's no filter there. There's no 6 different people in between that. So that's why his writings are regarded. This is why when Jesus comes on the scene, they say, we follow Moses, his teachings, who are you? So you've got cases where you've got Moses who speaks directly to God. And then probably the next step would be people who have an angel. So God sends an angel to then speak to them. So now you've got the angel between God and the man. This is often the case with prophets. They will receive, like the prophet Daniel 9. I was actually doing a study last night on Daniel 8 and 9, where Daniel receives direct revelation or inspiration from Gabriel. And then you've got the case where the Holy Spirit is moving the authors. 2 Peter 1:21 claims this, that holy men were moved by the Spirit. And in that case, what really is happening here is that the Spirit is bringing to light knowledge and clarity for people as they pen the books of the Bible. But this is not in a supernatural way where they zone off and then their hands are just writing like you see in sort of supernatural circles. They're inspired, but who they are as a person still comes through in the literature. And you can see this especially when you study the Greek and the Hebrew. The way that John wrote was very different to the way that Paul wrote. John, like probably how I would write. I'm not a scholar. He wrote street slang, street language. The Apostle Paul was a scholar. He wrote in a more different use of words. King David wrote differently to someone who was not a king. So you can still see the humanity coming through. And this is why even with the Bible writers, when they see something of spiritual nature, especially a vision, they're putting it in their words for their time. And this is where you see the human ability. And I think God orchestrated that, because if God spoke to us from heavenly language, we wouldn't understand it. But he uses the people of his time to speak to the people of that time. God is incredibly relatable. And so, yeah, that's a very general, basic outline of inspiration in the Bible.
I guess a lot of people on that note of a certain period of people wrote this at a certain time. And we see in a lot of the Bibles that things like the parables are written in a certain context, and we've got to look at the context of that to understand it. And so a lot of people have this argument of, yeah, I'm happy to follow like the commandments, and there's a lot of cool stories like you were saying, but it was written for a certain culture in a certain period. It doesn't have anything to do with us. Should we really be believing what it has to say about marriage and sexuality and slavery? Haven't we progressed past those things? Yeah, I don't know. What would you have to say to that?
Yeah, so this is, again, good question. It's really a question of relevancy. The issue with that statement is there are several assumptions that can be wrong. So people would look at, say, the Old Testament's writings on, let's take sexuality. That's a big topic, right? Sexuality. We have the LGBT movement and all of these sorts of things. I had a lovely chat with people of that persuasion. I had many lovely chats with people who made this claim. The Bible didn't know what it was talking about. But I did a series of lectures on this for people going back into ancient times when the Bible was written. These were topics that were just as contextual, just as relevant back then as they are today. You had all these sorts of things in that society. Now, the thing is with the Bible's relevancy and can we still take it seriously, what the Bible does is very unique. The Bible is a worldview. It looks at humanity through a certain lens. It exposes who we really are, and it gives answers to the great questions of life. So as long as humans are humans, the Bible's relevant. Purpose, meaning, why are we here? Where did we come from? Are we good? Or are we evil? These are all the big questions. And I would say that even when you look today at what's happening in society, we're in a very contentious society today. A lot of the topics that are really up for debate really come back to religious questions. As we've advanced scientifically, people really believe that we could do away with religion, but this has been proven to not be the case, that we still need religion. We still need these deeper questions of the soul, because no matter how many iPhones you have and technology, we actually are seeing a huge rise in depression. We're seeing a huge rise in mental illness. Why? Because you can't fill that void with things. Those are still questions that need answering. And so the Bible, in my case, is certainly the one that steps into those spiritual conversations, those deep and meaningful conversations. I remember hearing about an interview with Larry King, and he was interviewing one of the editors of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I'm going to paraphrase the conversation, but he asked him, he said, why is it that in all the encyclopedia that the subject of God is the largest? All the different topics of humanity. And the editor paused and said, because how you answer that question has the biggest implication on your life. It was quite a statement. And I absolutely agree. If you say there is no God, that has a huge implication on your life. Your life really has no purpose beyond what you give it. There is no real moral clarity. It's moral relativism. Everything's relative to what you believe. This is actually what we're seeing now in the West. As we've gotten rid of religion more and more, we've become more secular. We're having now really a time of moral relativism. But if you go, there is a God, okay, then which God? Jesus. Which Jesus? As we answer that question, huge implications. And the more I've studied this, I believe that is probably one of the central questions of humanity. Is there a God? The Bible is relevant for everything, tells us about who God is, tells us about who we are, and that is very important.
One of the other things that is often brought up in discussions around the Bible, Dan, is the reliability question. We have ancient accounts from all sorts of different writers, from your ancient Greek and Roman historians to Caesar himself writing about his conquests and things like that. And often the Bible's thrown into this sort of category of ancient literature, and we treat it with a certain level of skepticism. I know it's difficult to kind of, talk about them all without talking about some of them individually, depend on where you want to go with this. But How should we think about the reliability of the Bible as a piece of literature?
So when we look at the Bible, we have to break it down into different sections. First and foremost, it is a historical manuscript. So putting aside all the spiritual stuff, it is an ancient document. And that ancient document is a series of 66 books by 40 authors written over the span of around 1,500 years. So rather than one book, it's many books. And out of those books, the question is, there's some pretty big claims and big stories. There's a lot of narrative, big, powerful figures in there like King David and all of these sort of figures that a lot of people who are quite agnostic or atheist would say these are sort of legends like King Arthur, as you mentioned. Surely these are hyperboles that built over time. Can we test this? Or do we just take it by faith? The answer is, of course, we can, and we should. If this is a book about events that were real, then surely there must be evidence in history of this, whether it's manuscript, whether it's archaeological. And I'm happy to share a few things on that. Obviously, big topic. At the end, I'm happy to sort of reference a few things and places for people to go to study more. But I'll give you a little preview on probably just 3 points. There are many, but I'll give 3 arguments on the credibility of the manuscript itself and on the Bible as it claims to be. So let's look at archaeology. Archaeology surely is the study of going back and unearthing sites and to see if we have validation of people and places and events, right? So in archaeology, what we actually have found is that there has been no archaeological evidence to say that the Bible was wrong. In fact, the opposite has been true. And I've got a couple of quotes here by some well-known archaeologists. This is actually from Dr. Nelson Glueck. He says, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical description has often led to amazing discoveries." There's many quotes like this. I'll give you one more. This is from a Dr. Clifford Wilson, former director of the Australian Institute of Archaeology. He says this: "I know of no finding in archaeology that's properly confirmed which is in opposition to the scriptures. The Bible is the most accurate history textbook the world has ever seen." There are countless quotes from archaeologists. Now, you're going to have archaeologists, of course, that will refute or will try to debate this, but there's certainly they would be doing well to try and say that archaeology has disproved the Bible. Now, I'll mention a few things here that what you do actually see through history, however, if you go back, especially as we see the turn of the 1900s, we see Enlightenment come in, humanism. We see them trying to really push off religion because of evolution from the mid-1800s and really gaining. So what you tend to see is around that time, a lot of people having a very strong skepticism on the Bible. And so a lot of archaeologists were really out to disprove it. And I'll give you a couple of examples of biblical findings that really refuted this. So there were people, for example, that said that King David was not real. We haven't found anything archaeological. King David is just a mythical figure. Therefore, the Bible should not be taken with any credibility. And this was the case for many years. In fact, there were probably people who walked away from their faith because they went, well, we can't find anything of King David. This was made up. And if that's made up, then the rest of the Bibles can't be taken seriously. That happened until about 1993 when archaeologists discovered what's known as the Tel Dan inscription. You can look this up, Tel as in Teldan inscription. And on that actually has reference to the House of David or King David. And this has been really verified by archaeologists to be an inscription referring to the house or the kingship of King David. So this is an example of evidence to support King David as a king that lived in Israel. We have many of these situations. Another one would be...
Just a little editor's note here on the importance of the Tel Dan inscription. It was, as Daniel mentioned, discovered in 1993. To give you some context, I was born in 1992. I'm going to be 32 this year, so we've only had the Tel Dan inscription for a little more than 30 years. I hope that comparison doesn't get me into trouble. Editor Jared doesn't like it when I mention my age. He says it makes him feel old. The inscription itself was found on a stele. Steles were ancient standing stones upon which were written important religious and political messages. The particular stele in question was written at the direction of an Aramean king, that is, a king from Aram, who boasts about victory over two of his southern neighbors, the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. Now, you might be a little bit confused about that. Shouldn't those two things be the same? While we don't have time to go into the specifics, there is a robust academic discussion about the two kingdoms of Judah and Israel, whether they were ever truly united and what that looked like in the ancient world. We don't know that much about the stele, but what we do know is that in all likelihood, it was written by one Hazael of Damascus after defeating Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah. I'll leave a link to the Biblical Archaeology Society where they go into much more detail.
Another one would be, for example, in the book of Daniel 5, you have the reference to Belteshazzar. It's hard saying those names. Now, many people would look at this and say, wait a minute, we have no evidence within Babylonian records of Belteshazzar being a king or any of these sorts of things, and so the Bible is to be thrown out. It was a copy or something like this, right? So they're always going to assume the worst. It's funny how they won't apply this to other archaeological finds or other historical documents, but the Bible is always wrong, right, if there's any issues. But I would just say this, that the lack of evidence is not an evidence of absence. One thing I've found, having done Bible land tours through the Middle East and going to many sites, is there's still many sites that are yet to be excavated. So I think that probably the best approach is, if there is no evidence for a thing, you certainly can be skeptical, but to say that, that's just mean that there's absolutely disproven would be a sort of an immature response, I would say. Right? And I think that goes for any historical thing. So what they found with Belteshazzar, of course, after saying that he didn't exist, is they found the Nabonidus cylinder, and on that we actually have writings from the Babylonian king. It's actually a quote. I'll read it to you. This is from the King Nabonidus, recorded the history of the ziggurat and made a request to his god. So he's writing to his god on behalf of his son Belteshazzar. So here we have actual historical, archaeological evidence for Belteshazzar. So it says, as for Belteshazzar, the eldest son, the offspring of my heart, the fear of thy great divinity, cause thou to exist in his heart. So here, just one line I take from it. You can look up the whole cylinder online. But here you have another example of people discrediting the Bible, and then we have an archaeological find to verify this person did exist. He was who Daniel claimed him to be. Another quick example of this was the Hittite Empire.
Hey, me again. Very quick editor's note here. Everything that Dan is saying here is correct, except for the fact that he called Belteshazzar. To be clear, Nabonidus' son's name was Belshazzar, whereas Daniel's Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. Very similar names, and honestly, I blame the Babylonians. Get better names. All right, back to Dan.
Another quick example of this was the Hittite Empire in the Old Testament. Many references to this group of people called the Hittites. And what was really bold about it was they were like a rival to Egypt, who was a superpower of that time. And people just scoffed at this and said, there is no evidence of such an empire. And there were many people who, again, pointed to the Bible as a mythical book. Look at the inerrancy here. But of course, what happened is they ended up finding in 1906 up in Turkey, which in the ancient times is Anatolia, they found the capital of the Hittite Empire, which was Hattusha. And in Hattusha, they found a royal library which had 10,000 tablets, which helped to prove to archaeologists about the people, the land, everything. And what they come to find is the Bible was correct. There was a Hittite empire that rivaled that of Egypt. It was a huge empire that spanned what we know as modern-day Turkey. And now you can go into the British Museum and there's a whole section. If you're interested, go onto the Biblical Research Society. It's a great introduction website that they basically just have constant up-to-dates with any archaeological finds. Zanita actually came with me on the Bible Lands a few years ago. We went to a few sites that have recently been discovered from the Gospels, like the Pool of Bethesda, which is referenced in John 5. We also have the Pool of Siloam, which was referenced in John 9, where the blind man washed his eyes. These are just recent discoveries. I think the Pool of Siloam was only in 2004, was excavated. So there's a constant updating of archaeological findings, and each one of them just consistently verifies the biblical account. And what's interesting is up to that point, there's always skeptics saying, we haven't found it, therefore the Bible's not true. And yet we continue to find it. Now, I'll add a couple more things on that. Like I said, there's many archaeological finds, but if you look at the manuscripts themselves, so let's talk about the manuscript. So if I take the Bible as a manuscript, what about a lot of people have said this to me, I've played Chinese whispers, Pastor Dan. I've seen this happen where you stand at one end of the line, you tell it through, and by the end, we're saying the most random things. Surely this is what's happened to the Bible, right? In fact, Islam, one of the tenets of Islam is that it was seen as a revival movement because the Bible was corrupted. And so a new testament, a new truth was given by Gabriel to Muhammad, right? So this is seen as it's corrupted, the manuscript, here's the new clarity of the text. Mormonism, similar position, right? So the angel Moroni came to him and said, here are the golden tablets and this sort of thing. So there's always a sort of critique on the Bible that it's corrupted, that it's not valid because it's a copy of a copy, this sort of thing. So what do we find? So what's the evidence behind it? When we look at the Bible itself, and I'll just start with the Old Testament, yes, we don't have the originals because we're talking thousands of years ago and we're written on papyrus and this sort of thing. They just will not last. But we do have the copies. And really, when you come to any ancient document, really most historical documents, they're copies. They're sometimes copies of copies. So it's not that there's an issue around having the copy. The question is it consistent? If we have 10 copies of something, let's say you wrote a document, and this is, let me give you an example of how it would have actually happened. So let's say the Apostle Paul writes his letter to the Romans. Okay, so we have the handwritten letter of Romans. What's going to happen is he's not going to just send out his original to just go around the Christian churches. And even if he does, they're going to make a copy of that. because these things don't last. So they're going to copy that. And often when they would go in and be read at different churches, they're going to probably want to take that and hand copy that. So that's how you get the copies. Now, the question is, are they just willy-nilly copying it in their own language and not worrying about the validation of it? No, absolutely not. Because what we find in ancient cultures, especially oral traditional cultures, which is what the Bible was written in, there was incredible community accountability when it came to the stories and the manuscripts being passed down. So even before the Bible was written into record, like starting with Moses and onwards, orally, the accuracy was incredible. And there's actually been research to support this, that oral traditions still retain incredible accuracy passed on orally, because let's say I'm sitting there in my tribe and I'm telling the story of our ancestors. Well, the entire tribe holds me accountable to the accuracy of those stories. That's how important they are. Like if I just start adding details, I'm going to be held to account. But when we get to manuscripts, what we've actually found is and I'll give you an example of this. We have copies of the Bible extremely early. Now, if I was to compare this with, say, other ancient documentation, for example, if you take a very famous Roman historian named Tacitus. Tacitus was a senator and a historian in Rome. And he writes in the Annals of Rome from the time of Caesar Tiberius to that of Nero, so AD 14 to 68. He records, and it's seen by many Roman historians as a great, valid document. How many copies do we have of Tacitus's Annals of Rome? We have one copy. Okay, so one copy. Now, out of that one copy we have, the earliest copy we have to when Tacitus wrote his original is 900 years. Okay, so the copy is 900 years after the original. Now, the issue with that is we have to take that and still take that with a grain of salt and look to that and try and verify archaeology and all other sources, as good historians will do. But that is a struggle. It would have been better if we had, say, 10 copies, because then we could really compare out of all those copies, are they accurate? Are they consistent? That means it's probably true, right? But when you've only got one copy, it's hard to really validate. Did that copy get corrupted by the people who copied it, right? So the more copies you have actually allow you to look and see, was there any scribal errors? Was there any changes as the copies happen through history? So you want more copies, essentially.
So you mentioned there's accountability, but I'm not sure if you know about this, but wasn't there also like quite big consequences if you copied something incorrectly?
It was. It's not like you're going to get a death decree or anything, but when you, for example, look at the various, actually a good example would be like the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? So when you go out to the places of the Essenes and some of these sort of religious communities that were copying the Bible, the way they did it, there were whole very careful steps to the way that they would hand copy the Bible. In fact, they had a special pen just when they wrote the name of God, had to count everything, every line. There were other people who would check and recheck. If you made one error, the whole document was discarded, right? So the level of accountability was huge just for these documents. So the idea that they just sit down and go, this is how I remember the story, just not true at all. So we have this Chinese whispers position. When you understand ancient cultures and how important those stories were, especially, remember, they believe these were from God. They're not going to just add things and change things. These are extremely important, every detail, and they were held to account, not only in the oral tradition, but especially in the manuscript tradition. Okay. Just on the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s, up to that time, they had copies of the Old Testament, but for the first time, they were able to discover the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were actually copies of the Old Testament from around the 3rd century BC. Okay, so 300 years before Christ. And what they found as they brought up the modern Old Testament as we have it today to compare it to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a well over 99% accuracy, which is incredible. So that shows that after all 2,300 years, it's still accurate. We still have incredible thing, right? So that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were such a significant find, is they gave validation. So the earliest you can go back, right? The closest you can get to, say, Moses himself, who wrote it, that's going to give more validation, right? Now, when you get to the New Testament, going back to the example I give about manuscripts, is we see with so many of the historical manuscripts, whether it's talking about Caesar's Gallic Wars when he fought against the Gauls, you're talking 900 years, the copy is between the original, and even Homer's Iliad is the first copy, the earliest copy we have is 900 years after Homer wrote it. But what you have, and this is considered one of the greatest sort of sources, this is almost like the Bible for the Greeks, they call it. There are 650 copies of the Iliad, right? So they can compare all those across the board and say, what's the consistency here? What's probably the closest to the original that Homer wrote? Because you're always going to get slight differences. You get that many copies, 650, someone's going to probably misspell a word here and there. There is still, you've got to allow for some of those changes. But 650 is a lot. I mentioned that because that's one of the most incredible amount of copies we've got. But again, the earliest they've got to between Homer and the copy is 900 years. So what about the New Testament? Okay, so let's take the New Testament. When we look at it as a manuscript, are the copies that we have, and then compared to the original, how much time do we have to allow for change and, say, legend and hyperbole to kick in between when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the Apostle Paul wrote the letters between the copies? Like I said, in a lot of historical documents, you're talking hundreds and hundreds of years, right? With the New Testament, we have 5,600 and beyond manuscript copies. Okay, so that's incredible. Now, how early are they from the original to it? If you take, for example, 1 Corinthians, we have a copy of 1 Corinthians, and we have datings and writings and references to them within the first century. Now, I'll give you an example of this because this sort of ties into whether or not we go into the conversation about the canon of Scripture. But what we do actually have are these people called the church fathers, okay? And the church fathers are people that lived at the end of the first century into the second century. They were called church fathers because they actually some of them actually studied under the Apostle John, right? So that's how many steps removed are we from the original? We're only one step removed here. Some of them did, some of them didn't, but you've got people like Polycarp. Now, what we have from their writings at the end of the first century is they are quoting from these manuscripts as early as the first century, end of the first century. So we know they were already in existence. We know that they were around and that they were seen as credible, authoritative sources in the early Christian church. One scholar said, actually multiple scholars who have actually studied the church fathers have said that if all we had was the writings of the church fathers, we would have enough quotations of the New Testament that we could basically put together the New Testament just from all of the references of the church fathers, even if we didn't have the New Testament in our hands, in the copies of it. So that's how much they were quoting from it. That's how many sightings we have from them, from people like Polycarp and others who were not only quoting from, say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the books of Paul, but they were actually citing that Paul wrote this, John wrote this. So again, going back to that cultural accountability, these are people in the time who knew these people. They were quoting, this was from this person. This was an accountability. So that's incredibly accurate to have them citing those references. We can hold our Bible up to today and see that it matches perfectly with our New Testament as we see it to today. Now, just an important thing to recognize is that out of the 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and they vary in different ages, you'll probably hear things like the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus and all these sorts of things. They put Roman numerals on them because there's so many, you've got to number them, right? Some of them are written down later. Some of the copies are earlier. There's a variety of them. Some are just fragments. But what we actually find is if you put them all down and you put all those manuscripts down, is there some differences in the manuscript? The answer is yes. So the question really is, are those differences enough for us to go, wait a minute, has the Bible been corrupted? Is those differences in between those 5,000 manuscripts enough for us to throw the Bible out and say, how can we take any of it seriously? A person I would suggest to look into is a person called Professor Daniel Wallace. He's a world-leading expert in biblical manuscripts. Okay, very exciting topic, I know. But he basically makes an interesting statement. So his life work, his entire PhD is just on these specific differences and looking into them. So he studied many of these documents, he's cross-referenced them. His conclusion is this, and I'll quote this from him. He says, of the thousands of copies there are little differences in spelling and punctuation. But of those differences, 99.8% of them have no major impact on the credibility of the text and the meaning of the letters. So you do see differences. For example, like I think some of the documents misspell the name of John. But does that mean that the rest of the Bible's discredited? No, that was a simple error of the translator, of the copyist. But you'll see this consistently, that many New Testament manuscript scholars will say that the differences in the text, the little various slips of the pen or whatever it might be, have basically no impact on the consistency of the Bible. So as you hold the New Testament to today, you can be confident that both Old and New Testament have not been changed over the thousands of years.
Even when you look at, I know some people say like amongst the four Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's slight differences in the accounts of things. And I remember listening to, I think it was like one of the writers from like the New York Times or something. He was saying that when they look at situations of the past, it's actually more credible if there's slight differences, because people have different memories of things or they judge things slightly differently. So if you're getting the same exact story across the board, like identical, then they actually think that is not credible then, which is
it's
stunning.
Like collusion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's right. In a court of law, if you had 6 witnesses and there was no variation, they will call out collusion.
Yeah.
You guys got together, yeah. So you would expect with an eyewitness account, and this is especially prevalent within the resurrection narrative, that, yeah, there are definitely contradictions in the Bible between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the question is, not only this, that you expect to see that if the three of us saw a bomb explosion happen or some major event, and then we were interviewed, we're all going to look at that situation differently. But the core essence of our testimony is the same. There was a bomb. This happened. But we're looking from different perspectives, and we're going to emphasize certain things. I might emphasize the brightness of the explosion. Someone else might talk about how loud it was. This is what in the Gospels, for example, the Gospel of John was written well after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It was written at the end of the first century. Now, the time that John wrote his gospel, he even tells us why he wrote it in John 20, but he was writing very much in response, and scholars are in agreement with this, to combat rising heresies and issues that were rising within the Christian church, like Gnosticism. And so he writes this book, and in John 20, he even tells us, I write this to you that you may believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God, and that by believing you'll be saved. So he tells us, I'm writing this to basically convince you that Jesus is God, because there were a lot of people were questioning it. Greek philosophy was coming into Christianity. It was mingling up all sorts of ideas. People were contending over who Jesus was from all these different belief systems mingling into Christianity. And John was very much laying down a defense. Here's my position on this. So the Gospel of John, when you read it from that angle, he's not needing to really go back and cover what Matthew, Mark, and Luke have written. In fact, many believe Mark was the first gospel. Those are covered. So he's coming at it from his own angle. Now, does that mean just because he doesn't include something or he looks at the same story, is it one angel at the tomb or two angels at the tomb? They're emphasizing certain things. And this is just how it was in ancient times. So just because one writer says there were 2 demoniacs and another says 1, doesn't mean that there was only 1. It just means that the writer was emphasizing that one demoniac in that narrative about his role. So there are definitely differences and what seems to be contradictions, and they need to be taken seriously. There are great debates out there on this. You shouldn't brush it under the carpet. But the bigger question is, you must understand how historical people thought. We live in a time now of rigorous scientific academia. If you've been to university, we all know about plagiarism. These were just not concepts in the ancient world. The Apostle Paul cites many different people, never references them, because that's what you did, right? Yeah, it's understanding context, it's understanding how they wrote, but I've certainly found there hasn't been no apparent contradiction that has really shattered my faith in the story itself. And this is really what the Bible writers were focused on. They're not focused on what the name of that person, they're just like, this happened, Jesus did this thing, and that proves he's God. You see, that's the real focus.
I find it funny, depending on who you're talking to, there are so many different objections that come up when it comes to the Bible. I think we've already touched on really well the archaeological aspect, which is an area, a field that is constantly growing and evolving, and new discoveries are being made every day. And when it comes to skeptics, often those little nitpicky things in the Bible tend to be the points of contention. Even amongst religious people, there is this, I think, sometimes naive kind of assumption that there was one point where we had the perfect Bible, whether it's the KJV or whatever, which even when it was first published was considered to be out of date because the language was just old school, not to mention the fact that it was based on the Geneva Bible and the Bishop's Bible and some of these other ones. But also the fact, and I don't know that a lot of people really think about this very much, the fact that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls now, we've only had those for about 70 years. Like, it's the 1940s to the 1950s that we've had that we had Qumran and all that sort of stuff happening. I even have a Bible, the latest edition of the NRSV, the 5th edition, which came out just a few years ago, is different because of the stuff that we're uncovering in the Dead Sea Scrolls even today. So I think it's funny, when we talk about the Bible, a lot of the time we want to talk about it like it's this monolith, like it's something that we just have to get this pure version of the Bible, and then it's going to be the best version and nothing can change, when nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah. And this is a good question. A real contentious question within Christianity is, what version is the true version, right? This is part of your question. The King James is often cited. And look, I love the King James. My first Bible was a King James. And if you're a Protestant, it has a special place in your heart. It was right in the heart of the Protestant Reformation. It was a big stance against the Catholic Church of Europe. But really, to understand this and to make sense of it is to realize that no translation is perfect, because the only true Bible is the Greek and the Hebrew. Is because when you look at the Greek, those who've studied Greek realize that it's very difficult to take really the essence of what the Greek is saying and put it perfectly into English, right? Or whether you're from the Philippines or from Africa, whatever your language is. So Bible scholarship, especially manuscript scholarship, is constantly evolving as we learn. These men, I take my hat off, it looks really boring what they do, but they will take a word, they'll go back to that time, they'll study everything written, how that particular word is used, so then how would that be translated at that time? It makes sense, because we have a certain vernacular today. We're in 2024, Australia. We speak English. It's usually bad English in Australia, right? We shorten everything. If 2,000 years from now, people took our conversation, they would have to, English is going to change. It's going to change a lot in 2,000 years. They would have to come back and study everything, how people spoke in Australia, the slang, the use of the word, and then listen to this conversation and make sense of the context and the use of words that we have. So it's a big discipline to have. So when you go back to the development of the early Bibles, for example, someone like Erasmus, who was a Dutch theologian, he was a big influence in translating it into the modern language. These guys were rushing to get it to the printing press, trying to beat the printing press sometimes. There were a lot of errors made. So they even themselves would bring out new Bibles, new manuscripts as they evolved in their understanding of the Greek. And one of the big changes that happened was a lot of the early translations were coming from the Latin. But when they got their hands on the Greek, it opened up their world. This was a huge revelation that really was important in the Protestant Reformation. Luther and others would start to go back to the Greek. And so Greek scholarship it really kicks off in the 1500s as far as translation. But even now, a lot of the modern Bibles coming out, just updates, and you'll even see little references and footnotes, which is a great thing that scholars do. Will say this word can mean this or this, because again, they're working off 5,000 copies. They've got to try and look at, some of them use this word, some of them have used this word. We're going to put them all in there for you to make your mind up on what it means. But yeah, it's the only true Bible is the Greek and the Hebrew. And even then, it takes years of discipline to learn how to even translate that. Those of us who've studied theology, our professors made us do this. It was painful.
It was painful. I can definitely affirm that.
Thankfully, the Jesus and the people who were writing the scriptures didn't use sarcasm as much like our modern day Australians. Otherwise, we would be very confused, I imagine.
feel sorry for anyone trying to translate Australian later on.
Dan, you mentioned you want to just cover the topic of prophecy. Did you want to go into that?
Yeah, sure. I think it needs to be mentioned as an evidence. It is an evidence. For example, I had a lovely Muslim friend I used to visit in Sydney, and we would talk about religion, and I really enjoyed learning of his faith, and he would ask me questions. And I remember him asking me about prophecy because I'm from what I understand, the I forgot the name of their Bible.
Quran.
Quran. I kept having the Dead Sea Scrolls in my head. The Quran, from what I understand, doesn't have prophecy in it. They would look to its literary style and its beautiful literature to say that itself is a verification of its divine authorship, etc. But the Bible, from what I've heard, is about a 1/3 prophecy. There's a lot of prophecy in the Bible. And some of those are minor prophets and major prophets and all sorts of things. And that itself is a big truth claim, right? The Bible even says that God claims to know the end from the beginning. So he even says, come and see, I am the Lord. I know the end from the beginning, right? So there are many references. Jesus himself would say, talk about future things, and he would predict things, right? So predictions are certainly in the Bible. Now, what do we do with that? When you look at these claims of being able to predict the future, it is a huge claim. If any of us could do it, I would be wondering what you're in tune with, right? How could you do that? If we were to take just a basic prophecy, let's say Daniel chapter 2, a very sort of famous prophecy, we have a vision that is given to King Nebuchadnezzar of a statue, and it outlines world history. You just take one of these prophecies, Daniel 2, there are 7 predictions in Daniel 2. And you have essentially a sort of chronology of kingdoms. Now, Daniel is claiming to write this in the time of the Babylonian Empire, which is around the 6th century BC. And he's looking into the future, right? Or God has given this divine dream. So again, it's claiming that the divine is connecting to the human and giving this divine revelation of world events. And in the story of Daniel 2, Daniel interprets the dream. God gives him essentially the ability to interpret the dream. And what he lays out is these kingdoms from Babylon. Babylon will fall. The Persian Empire will take over. After the Persians will come the Greeks. Now, he doesn't name these kingdoms. We know now because we can look back. But what's interesting when you look at it is it's incredibly detailed. So you have a Babylonian kingdom, it falls, you have a Persian kingdom, then you have a Greek kingdom, then you have the Romans. But then it says after this kingdom, it's not taken over, but rather it disintegrates. Part of it remains, but part of it fragments, which is an interesting thing. Now, if you look at history, this is exactly what happens. You have the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. And the Romans are never overthrown by another nation. They essentially internally disintegrate. You have the barbarian hordes coming down from the north when the Vandals are coming across the west in 400. So it's around 457 or mid 400s that we see Western Rome disintegrate into the tribes of the various tribes from the north that come down. So it's not conquered. Eastern Rome remains, but Western Rome carves into what we know today as modern Europe. And so biblically, this is exactly what the Bible claimed to have predicted 600 years before Christ. That's incredible. Not only that, but it says within the prophecy that they will try and mingle and try to reunite this sort of European nation. They will mingle with the seeds of men, which means they'll intermarry. Well, what do we find in European history? We find all the different monarchs trying to marry and intermingle to try and bring unity. It never works. We see Kaiser Wilhelm, we see Napoleon, we see all the people try and fail to unite Western Europe. Justinian tries, all these different people. So here we have, out of the 6 of the 7 predictions, incredibly accurate. And this is a basic prophecy. And so the question then comes up with the skeptic, there's no way that Daniel could have known this. So therefore, Book of Daniel must have been written in the time of the Roman Empire, right? People have added to this. Well, and many people did dispute this for many years. They said there's just no way that Daniel knew this, and therefore it was added later or something, until we found, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which again is the copies of the Bible. And in there we find the Book of Daniel. Again, these are copies from the 3rd century BC. Now, again, the 3rd century is the time of the Greeks, right? So here we have copies of Daniel from as way back as the 3rd century, which assumes that if it's in the 3rd century, then it's well established and circulated before that. which puts us pretty close to the time of Daniel. Over and over, we see these situations where the Bible claims these prophecies. They're incredibly accurate. You can even get to the time of the Messiah and all sorts of things. Incredibly accurate times and dates, proven over and over. And yet we have validation within the Bible. So prophecy itself is a source of authority. It is an evidence in itself.
You did mention and we don't have to go into great detail about that, but you did mention the canon not long ago. And I guess this is something that I've heard a lot of people. I remember I was working a job a few years ago and people found out that I went to church and read the Bible, and they were like, don't you know, people just decided what went in there and just left stuff out that they didn't want us to know. Like the classic one that is brought up is like the Book of Thomas. And people think that there's like an agenda, and so they've left stuff out of that.
Yeah, well, this was really popularized with the Da Vinci Code, if you remember, a few years back. I never watched it, but I certainly heard all the arguments coming out. And it's a very entertaining story. The church has covered up that there was an affair with Mary. And they actually Dan Brown takes some of this from some of what we call the Gnostic Gospels. He's also obviously added a lot of things in there. And in his claims, when he talks about the development of the Bible, or what's called the canon, is that there was a lot of differentiation with the scholars. They didn't agree, and so they left certain things out because it mentions these secret things. Is there truth to that, right? So the answer is no, there's not at all to this claim. And to give you a little bit of history, the Bible as we know it, and let's take, for example, the New Testament and the writings of the Bible. Well, they were well recognized with authority in the 1st and 2nd century. Right? We have church fathers, as Christianity's growing, they're quoting from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, this sort of thing. We have Jesus quoting from Daniel. We have Matthew quoting from the whole Old Testament. So they're all quoting each other very early on as sources of authority, right? So that the books as you know it, the books of Paul and the letters of Paul and this sort of thing. So we have very early on accepted authority within tradition of the church very early on. Now, later on, what happens is as Constantine, the emperor, converts to Christianity in the 3rd century, he essentially starts to bring together councils to really answer this question foremost, especially over theological challenges. There was the Council of Nicaea and many other councils where they not only looked at the books of the Bible to put it together, but they also looked at theological questions to sort of go, here is our position as a Christian church. Now, when it comes to the canon, it developed over many years. But what they did when they got together, the sort of scholars who looked at the different books to see what constitutes the New Testament, there were certain steps they had to take, and I'll take you through them very briefly. The first thing they did is they looked at, for example, apostolic authority. So was this book written by an apostle, right? Was this written by Matthew? Or was it written by someone who claims to be Matthew and he lived 100 years later? Because what we do find is there are these what's called Gnostic Gospels or other letters that are written, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel, I think there's of Mary, there's all sorts of different ones, right? The Book of Enoch. Now, when you look at them, number one, we have no one citing them in the early century. Secondarily, these people who wrote them, these sources, did not know the apostles, so they're not one step removed from the apostles. So, for example, Luke was not an apostle. He was actually someone who went to the apostles. He spoke with them. He even mentions it in the first chapters when he talks to Theophilus. I totally missed his word there, but he goes to the sources, the eyewitness sources, and says, I have done this, I have gained an account, and I have written a record of these things. And so he's claiming that he's spoken to these people. Now, it's circulated, it's seen as an authority, it's recognized in the church. That holds a lot of validity. But then you have what's called the synoptic gospels. These are the ones that actually have eyewitness. So John was an eyewitness, Matthew. And so that's the first step. Any of these letters, because what we do know with some of these other gospels, they're written like 100 years after Jesus, some of them even further. And so you go, that's pretty close, but it's not as close as Paul or Peter or these sorts of people. So it doesn't have apostolic authority, and it certainly is not mentioned in the early sources. So that's a cross if it misses that. Secondarily, antiquity, when was it written? As I've mentioned, was it written close to the events? Because even if you're not an apostle, if you were around to see the witnesses, that should be pretty credible, right? So even if there's a gospel of Sally, right, and she's writing about Jesus, but she actually saw stuff, that is interesting. We need to take that credible. The problem is with a lot of these gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, they're written, like I said, way after the events by people who didn't know any of the apostles, didn't even know people who knew the apostles. And so they're very far removed from the source.
If I could just jump in as well, a lot of the problems as well, Dan, is a lot of them are written by people claiming to not be who they actually are. In other words, claiming to be John or Peter or Paul or whatever, and they're actually basically just faking it.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the evidences, because originally the Gospels, I'll take the Gospels, for example, we read it, this is the Gospel of Matthew. That was originally not in there because Matthew didn't cite himself as author. It was just known that was from Matthew. It was very well evidenced in that time. So later on, when you get, this is the Gospel of Thomas, they know straight away. None of the gospel writers did that. None of these early writers did that. They didn't put their name on it. So that in itself is an interesting evidence against them on that case. Yeah. The other thing too is, just to add to that, is the third point of orthodoxy, right? So is it theologically in line with the rest of Scripture? Again, because remember, they have early sources authoritating, quoting from the letters of Paul and the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know that they're authoritative. We know that the early church fathers, who are simply one step removed from the apostles, are quoting from them. When we pick up the Gospel of Thomas or any of these other Gospels, do they harmonize theologically with the picture that Christ has portrayed? What you find is some really weird stuff. And the reason why they're called Gnostic Gospels is because Gnosticism, which was a weird theological blend of Greek philosophy and Christianity, was really rising at the end of the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century. And its theology couldn't be more further from biblical truth, right? And so they're called Gnostic Gospels because Gnosticism is based on the idea that you grow through this sacred knowledge, right? But the beliefs of God and the beliefs of Jesus and all these sorts of things are just so in contradictory to the consistency of Scripture. So that it's very easy to point that out and to see that these don't match up. The language, the use of the words, the way they describe it's clearly Gnostic in its influence, right? The other reason you might ask is, why are people even doing these manuscripts? Well, there's money to be gained in manuscripts. You can gain authority. There's all sorts of reasons that people have to forge a manuscript. Enoch certainly didn't write the Book of Enoch. Enoch lived a pretty long time ago. But there are people who will go, look, I discovered this, and that gives them wealth or whatever it might be. So this is a pretty common thing in the Middle Ages, especially. A lot of people are claiming to find the nail that crucified Jesus, or a papyrus or something, and a lot of forgeries. So biblical scholars have to really weave through this. They're still good to read. It gives you a sense of the times that people were living and the beliefs. But are they inerrant, inspired word of God? According to the people who put the canon together, it didn't make the mark. So, yeah.
Really helpful point. So that's, makes it, I guess, a lot more believable that it's not just a bunch of people deciding, this sounds a bit fishy, this out. Let's add this in instead. But Dan, I guess just bringing this home, we are out of time, and there's obviously a lot more that we could touch on this. But what does all this mean for the man next door who's a carpenter, or the lady who sells her bread at the market store? What does all this matter for our culture, our time?
What does it mean? It means that you can pick up the Bible and have confidence that the claims it makes of itself is very likely true. Now, again, I've only given manuscript evidence. None of these things have claimed that the divine elements are true. It just claims that as an archaeological and historical document, it's very solid. You've got to investigate for yourself the claims it makes about Jesus, the claims it makes about humanity, the claims it makes about God, the end of the world, etc. Are they true? And what I would encourage anybody to do is, going back to the Encyclopedia Britannica question, if there is a God, then that is worth investigating. I think any of us, just to throw off religion purely because we have presuppositious positions, or we think religion is a certain thing, you're probably very likely wrong. The story of humanity, the story of God found in the Bible, will open your eyes not only to the world, but to yourself. And it paints a picture, a very important, clear, and true picture of humanity, of yourself, that you need to see. And also, most of all, it points you to God. There's a beautiful quote in a book called The Pursuit of God, by A.W. Tozer. And he says that the Bible is not an end in of itself, but the means to God. Now, what he means by that is, it's one thing to study the Bible and go text to text, but the Bible is just the bridge to take us to a real being called God. And that would be my encouragement, to pray for truth, to seek for truth, and to take seriously the claims of the Bible. And you'll find that is certainly worth investigating.
Awesome. Jesse, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask?
One question. Obviously, we want to encourage people to open up the Bible and read it for themselves. But if somebody did want to open up the Bible but had no idea where to start, number one, where would you recommend they start? And number two, if they're reading through it and they're just going, what in the world does any of this mean? Are there any helpful resources that you found useful to help you interpret the Bible, to dig into it a little bit better from a layman's perspective?
Yeah, definitely. Just recognize that when you start reading the Bible, it will be challenging because you're going back in time, you're reading about cultures that you don't understand. Stick with it. I would encourage, if you're just beginning, start with a modern translation. The ESV is good, English Standard Version. And if you're finding it hard to read, don't worry. Most of people in human history couldn't read, right? Connected to God through songs and stories. We're actually better off with stories. So when I first came in the church, I would put on old VCR tapes. Some people remember what they are. And I would watch the Gospel of Matthew, right? Or the Book of Acts, because I'm not a reader. I'm just a footy kid from mining town. So for me, I would just watch bits and pieces and go, oh yeah, this Jesus guy is nice. And I'd learn about the Bible. And bit by bit, as you stick with it, when I would go to read the Bible, it made it a little easier for me. So don't be discouraged if you're not a big reader. Most people aren't. Most of what we consume is audio. So there's a great introductory website called the Bible Project. They do great illustrations and videos. Some of them are, I think most of them are animations. They pick topics and biblical topics and they present them really well. If you're wanting to get a little deeper, you can go to a website called the Blue Letter Bible or Bible Study Tools. They have commentaries and things. So if you read a text, you're like, what does that mean? You can actually click on what's called commentaries. And this is where scholars will step in and actually give descriptions. This is what Paul means when he says this. And so that's more your advanced study. You can go to those. Those are free online, great sources of support. If you're wanting to get into some of the topics that we talked about today, which is called the topic of apologetics, which means the defense of the Christian faith, a really good introduction book is The Case for Christ. It's in no way comprehensive, in no way perfect, but it's a really good introduction book. I know a lot of people have enjoyed it, going into some of these topics in more detail. The person who wrote it, Lee Strobel, was a skeptic. He came in with a lot of these challenging questions to these Bible scholars. And really the book is essentially the story and of all the interviews that he had. And he comes out, of course, a Christian. He just says the evidence is overwhelming. So that's a great one. If you're wanting more on apologetics, CARM, CARM.org is the Christian Apologetics and Resource Ministry website. Great stuff on there as well. But yeah, if I was to start in the Bible, I would start reading the Gospels to know the story of Jesus. And then everything else around the Bible centers on him. And so you can then go out from there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
No.
Case for Christ is one of the first books I read, and it was really good. It answers a lot of questions like, do we actually know that Jesus existed, and is there any evidence that he rose again, and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, thank you, Dan, so much for sharing with us today. It's been great to have you on. We'll have to get you back another time for a more lengthy discussion to answer more questions.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Science Radio. I certainly did. I'm always keen to talk about the Bible and everything around it, and the conversation that we had with Dan was super rich. So thank you again, Dan. If you'd like to learn more about what we talked about with Dan, all of the recommendations, the links, and the sources are in the show notes of the podcast. There's some fascinating stuff in there, so I definitely recommend having a look. Other than that, thank you very much for listening to another episode of Science Radio. If you've been enjoying what you're listening to and you haven't already, please subscribe. That would help us immensely. And if you already are subscribed, we'd really appreciate a rating or a review on the podcasting app of your choice. Finally, if you really want to help us out, we'd appreciate it if you shared this episode with a friend. Remember, everything that we talked about today and more can be found on sciencemag.com. The link is in the show notes, where you'll be able to read all of our articles, access past episodes, and so much more. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.